Welcome back to the Python tutorial series. I'm so glad you're here. This is the 15th video in the series, and today we will learn about functions. I'll first introduce what a function is, then we will write a function with parameters. After that, I will introduce the return statement and then discuss what scope is. Finally, we will write a program that uses a function to see whether or not a number is prime. The timestamps are in the description below. So let's get started. So what exactly is a function? Instead of repeating a group of lines of code multiple times, you can just use a function. That's what makes a function so powerful. In order to use a function, you must first define it and then call it. I created a function here called saySomething, and you use def to define it. And then after the colon on the next line, we're in the function. And then I can print something like hello world. And when I run this, nothing happens because we just defined it, we didn't call it. In order to call it, all we need to do is saySomething, open and close parentheses, and now when we run it, it will output hello world. So that's the basics of a function. You can also create a function that has parameters. For example, I'm going to create sayName and then have a parameter called name. And then inside of this function, we're going to print hello plus name. Then when we call the function sayName, we need to input a parameter name. For example, my name's Jonathan, so I'm going to do Jonathan. And then when I run this, it outputs hello Jonathan. Instead of writing the code, hello this person's name, hello that person's name hundreds of times, if you're doing something like that, you can just use this function called sayName that we just created and then replace it with any name. So, hello Jonathan, hello Billy, and that's how it works. One thing to note about functions is that you must define the function before you call the function. For example, here on line 8, I called the function doesn't work, but I don't define it till line 9. So when I run this function, it won't print this doesn't work. It will give an error. Doesn't work is not defined because code reads from top to bottom, so it hasn't seen this yet. So it doesn't know that the function is there at line 9. Another thing that makes functions powerful is that you can return something from the function. For example, if I wanted to add two numbers, I could create a function called sum and have two parameters a and b, and then I can return the result by doing return a plus b. And then I can call the function by inputting 3 and 4. And you're like, does this output 7? No, it doesn't. It doesn't output anything because it doesn't have anywhere to put it. But if I print the sum of 3 and 4, that will then work. And then when I run this, I will get 7. I could also assign the result to a variable like a. Then a now equals 7 because a equals the sum of 3 and 4. And then when I print a, I will get 7 as well. If I call sum but don't input any parameters, it will give me an error because it expected two values a and b. So this doesn't work. What's nice about parameters is that you can set a default parameter. For example, b equals 1. So if the user only inputs one parameter instead of two, the default for b will be 1. You can also set defaults for both, for example a equals 3 and b equals 1. However, you can't do a equals 3 and then b, because if you have a default parameter for one thing, all the parameters to the right of that parameter must also have a default. One thing to note with division is that someone could enter 0 for b, and that would cause a divide by 0 error. So to prevent this from happening, we can do if b equals 0, return cannot divide by 0. Otherwise, we'll return a divided by b. One thing to note with return is that once you return something, it exits the function. so nothing else will happen inside the function. The function is complete. So if b equals 0, it will return cannot divide by 0, and it won't even see the next line, return a divided by b. So let's test this just to make sure it works. And when we print division with default parameters 2 and 0, it will output cannot divide by 0. When we input 2 and 2, it will output 1. When we input just one parameter, 3, it will give us 3 back because the default for b is 1. And when we don't put any parameters, it will give us an error because we need to define at least a because there's no default. And that is how to use return and functions. So now let's talk about scope. I created a function called add and have two parameters, a and b. Then I set c equal to a plus b. Then I return c. If I were to define a equal to 77, that would have no correlation whatsoever to the parameter a, because this a is inside the function, versus when a equals 77, that is outside the function. So when I print add 1 and 2, that will give me 3, because that a on line 4 has no correlation to the parameter a. Similarly, if I were to print c, that would cause an error because c is not defined. C is only defined inside the function, not outside the function. I'm going to create a new function called subtract. I'm going to create a new variable f, but instead of just creating it inside the function, I'm going to put this keyword global. So what global means is that f will be inside the function as well as outside the function. Then I will set f to equal d minus e, and then return f, and then I'll call the subtract function and input 1 and 2 for the parameters. After that, I will print f. And when I do this, it will give us a value because f is global. So it will output -1 because 1 minus 2 is -1. And because it's global, we can use this variable outside the function and it will output -1 when we print f. So that is an overview of scope in Python. Now let's create a function to see if a number is prime. I created a function called isPrime and it has one parameter, num. Prime numbers have to have a value of at least 1. So if it is less than 1, I'm gonna return invalid number. Now that we know that it's greater than 1, I'm gonna create a for loop and I'll do for I in range 2 comma number. If number divided by I has a remainder equal to 0, we know that it's not a prime number, so we're going to return false. If we go through the entire for loop and it never returns false, it must be a prime number, so then we can return true. So let's ask the user to input a positive integer to see if it is prime. We're going to set answer to equal the function is prime with the parameter ask. So after the user inputs a positive integer, it will run this function. Then let's print the answer. So when we run this, it will ask us to input a positive integer. So let's say 7. And that is a prime number. Now let's say something like 4, and that is not a prime number. And let's be crazy now and say something like, is -1 a prime number? And we get invalid number. So it works. Another great thing about functions is that we can have repeating functions, and we can use our last example for this. Last time it returned invalid number every time we had an invalid number, but if it's an invalid number, we can have the function run again until it's a valid number. Instead of returning invalid number, I'm just gonna print invalid number inside the function. And then, since we know it's an invalid number, we can do ask again. ask equals integer input, enter a positive integer inside the function, and then we can do the function again, is prime, and then ask, and then it will always return true or false. For example, when we run this and input -1, it's gonna say invalid number, and then it's gonna ask us for another number. So this time, let's input 3, and that is a prime number. And just to verify that this still works, let's enter 4. It will return false because 4 is not a prime number. And if we kept repeating a negative number over and over again, it would keep on asking us to input a positive number until we do. And there you have it. That's how you repeat functions in Python. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to follow along with this video series by subscribing and hitting the notification bell, or by clicking on the next video so that you can expand your knowledge about Python. And as always, I can't wait to see you next time.